Section 2 of Part 1, December 2nd through December 16th. Chapter 1 of Part 2 of Part 1, Boston, Massachusetts. Viola Fletcher, a 58-year-old elementary school teacher, mother of 2 daughters, wife of a devoted husband, a wry and witty woman with an infectious laugh, was silent now and still, lying on the operating table, unconscious, her life in Dr. Ginger Weiss's hands. Ginger's entire life had been a funnel focusing on this moment. For the first time, she was assuming the senior surgeon's role in a major and complicated procedure. Years of arduous education and immeasurable weight of hopes and dreams lay behind her ascension to this moment. She had a prideful yet humbling sense of just how great a distance her journey had covered, and she was half sick with dread. Mrs. Fletcher had been anesthetized and draped in cool green sheets. None of the patient's body was visible except that portion of her torso on which surgery would be performed, a neat square of flesh painted with iodine and framed by lime-colored cloth. Even her face was out of sight beneath tinted sheeting as an added precaution against airborne contamination of the wound that would shortly be made in her abdomen. The effect was to depersonalize the patient, and perhaps that was in part the intent of the draping as well, thereby sparing the surgeon the need to look upon the human face of agony and death if, God forbid, his skill and education should fail him. On Ginger's right, Agatha Tandy, the surgical technician, stood ready with spreaders, rakes, hemostats, scalpels, and other instruments. On her left, a scrub nurse was prepared to assist. Another scrub nurse, the circulating nurse, the anesthesiologist, and his nurse also waited for the procedure to begin. George Hannaby stood on the other side of the table, looking less like a doctor than like the former star fullback on a pro football team. His wife, Rita, had once talked him into playing Paul Bunyan in a comedy sketch for a hospital charity show, and he had appeared at home in a woodsman's boots, jeans, and a red plaid shirt. He brought with him an aura of strength, calmness, and competency that was most reassuring. Ginger held out her right hand. Agatha put a scalpel in it. A keen, thin, bright curve of light outlined the razor-sharp edge of the instrument. Hand poised over the score lines on the patient's torso, Ginger hesitated and took a deep breath. George's stereo tape deck stood on a small table in the corner, and familiar strains of Bach issued from the speakers. She was remembering the ophthalmoscope, the shiny black gloves. However, as frightening as those incidents had been, they had not utterly destroyed her self-confidence. She had felt fine ever since the most recent attack, strong, alert, energetic. If she had noticed the slightest weariness or fuzzy-mindedness, she would have canceled this procedure. On the other hand, she had not acquired her education, had not worked 7 days a week all these years, only to throw away her future because of 2 aberrant moments of stress-related hysteria. Everything was going to be fine, just fine. The wall clock said 7:42. Time to get on with it. She made the first cut. With hemostats and clamps and a faultless skill that always surprised her, she moved deeper, constructing a shaft through skin, fat, and muscle into the center of the patient's belly. Soon the incision was large enough to accommodate both her hands and those of her assisting physician, George Hannaby, if his help should be required. The scrub nurses moved close to the table, one on each side, grasped the sculpted handles of the retractors, and pulled back gently on them, drawing apart the walls of the wound. Agatha Tandy picked up a fluffy, absorbent cloth and quickly blotted Ginger's forehead, careful to avoid the jeweler's lenses that protruded from her operating glasses. Above his mask, George's eyes squinted in a smile. He was not sweating. He seldom did. Ginger swiftly tied off bleeders and removed clamps, and Agatha ordered new supplies from the circulating nurse. In the brief blank spaces between Bach's concertos and in the silence at the end of the tape before it was turned over, the loudest sounds in the tile-walled room were the sibilant exhalations and groaning inhalations of the artificial lung machine that breathed for Viola Fletcher. The patient could not breathe for herself because she was paralyzed by a Curer-derived muscle relaxant. Though entirely mechanical, those sounds possessed a haunting quality that made it impossible for Ginger to overcome her apprehension. On other days when George cut, there was more talk. He traded quips with the nurses and the assisting resident, using light banter to reduce the tension without also reducing concentration on the vital task at hand. Ginger was simply not up to that sort of dazzling performance, which seemed akin to playing basketball, chewing gum, and solving difficult mathematical problems at the same time. Having completed the excursion into the belly, she ran the colon with both hands and determined that it was healthy. With damp gauze pads provided by Agatha, Ginger cradled the intestines, placed the hoe-like blades of the retractors against them, and turned them over to the scrub nurses who held them out of the way, thus exposing the aorta, the main trunk line of the body's arterial system. From the chest, the aorta entered the belly through the diaphragm, running parallel to the spine. Immediately above the groin, it split into two iliac arteries leading to the femoral arteries in the legs. There it is, Ginger said, an aneurysm, just like in the x-rays. As if to confirm it, she glanced at the patient's x-ray that was fixed on the light screen on the wall at the foot of the operating table. A dissecting aneurysm just above the aortic saddle. Agatha blotted Ginger's forehead. The aneurysm, a weakness in the wall of the aorta, had permitted the artery to bulge outward on both sides, forming a dumbbell-shaped extrusion full of blood, which beat like a second heart. This condition caused difficulty in swallowing, extreme shortness of breath, severe coughing, and chest pains, and if the bulging vessel burst, death followed swiftly. As Ginger stared at the pulsing aneurysm, an almost religious sense of mystery overcame her, a profound awe, as if she had stepped out of the real world into a mystic sphere where the very meaning of life was soon to be revealed to her. Her feeling of power, of transcendence, rose from the realization that she could do battle with death and win. Death was lurking there in the body of her patient right now, in the form of the throbbing aneurysm, a dark bud waiting to flower, but she had the skill and training to banish it. From a sterile package, Agatha Tandy had taken a section of artificial aorta, a thick ribbed tube that split into two smaller tubes, the iliac arteries. It was woven entirely of dacron. Ginger positioned it over the wound, trimmed it to fit with a pair of small sharp scissors, and returned it to the technician. Agatha put the white graft in a shallow stainless steel tray that already contained some of the patient's blood, and swished it back and forth to wet it thoroughly. The graft would be allowed to soak until it had clotted a bit. Once it was installed in the patient, Ginger would run some blood through it, clamp it, allow that blood to clot a bit more, then flush it out before actually sewing it in place. The thin layer of clotted blood would help prevent seepage, and in time the steady flow of blood would form a neointima, a leak-proof new lining virtually indistinguishable from that in a real artery. The amazing thing was that the dacron vessel was not merely an adequate substitute for the damaged section of aorta, but was in fact actually superior to what nature had provided. 500 years from now, when nothing remained of Viola Fletcher but dust and time-worn bones, the dacron graft would still be intact, still flexible and strong. Agatha blotted Ginger's forehead. "How do you feel?" George asked. "Fine," Ginger said. "Tense?" "Not really," she lied. He said, "It's a genuine pleasure watching you work, Doctor." "I'll second that," said one of the scrub nurses. "Me too," the other said. "Thanks," Ginger said, surprised and pleased. George said, "You have a certain grace in surgery, a lightness of touch, a splendid sensitivity of hand and eye that is, I'm sorry to say, not at all common in the profession." Ginger knew that he never gave voice to an insincere compliment, but coming from such a stern taskmaster, This bordered on excessive flattery. By gosh, George Hannaby was proud of her. That realization flooded her with warm emotion. If she had been anywhere but in an operating room, tears would have come to her eyes. But here she kept a tighter rein on her feelings. However, the intensity of her reaction to his words made her aware of how completely he had filled the role of father figure in her life. She took nearly as much satisfaction from his praise as she would have taken if it had come from Jacob Weiss himself. Ginger proceeded with the operation in better spirits. The disturbing possibility of a seizure slowly receded from her thoughts, and greater confidence allowed her to work with even more grace than before. Nothing could go wrong now. She set about methodically controlling the flow of blood through the aorta, carefully exposing and temporarily clamping all branching vessels, using thin elastic loops of extremely pliable plastic tubing to valve off the smaller vessels, placing mosquito clamps and bulldog clamps on the larger arteries, including the iliacs and the aorta itself. In little less than an hour, she had stopped all blood flow through the aorta to the patient's legs, and the throbbing aneurysm had ceased its mocking imitation of the heart. With the small scalpel, she punctured the aneurysm, releasing a pool of blood. The aorta deflated. She sliced it open along its anterior wall. At that moment, the patient was without an aorta, more helpless and more dependent upon the surgeon than at any other time. There was no going back now. From this point on, the operation must be conducted not only with the greatest care, but with the most prudent speed. A hush had fallen on the surgical team. What little conversation there had been now ceased. The Bach tape had reached the end again, and no one moved to turn it over. Time was measured by the wheezing and sucking of the artificial lung machine, and by the beeping of the EKG. Ginger removed the Dacron graft from the steel tray where it had been soaking up blood and clotting precisely as desired. She sewed the top of it into the aortal trunk using an extremely fine thread. Then, with the top of the graft sewn in place and the unattached bottom clamped off, Ginger filled it with blood to let it clot again. Throughout these steps of the operation, it had not been necessary for Ginger to have the sweat blotted from her forehead. She hoped that George noticed her new dryness. She was sure he did. Without needing to be told that it was once again time for music, the circulating nurse reset the Bach tape. Hours of work lay ahead of Ginger, but she pressed on without the least weariness. She moved down the draped body, folding back the green sheets, revealing both of the patient's thighs. With the help of the circulating nurse, Agatha had replenished the instrument tray and was ready now with everything that Ginger needed to make 2 more incisions, one in each of the patient's legs, below the inguinal creases where the legs attached to the body trunk. Clamping and tying off vessels, Ginger eventually exposed and separated the femoral arteries. As with the aorta before, she used thin elastic tubing and a variety of clamps to valve off the blood flow through these vascular fields, then open both arteries where the bifurcated legs of the graft would attach to them. A couple of times she caught herself humming along happily with the music, and the ease with which she worked made it seem almost as if she had been a surgeon in an earlier life, now reincarnated into the elite brotherhood of the caduceus predestined for this labor. But she should have remembered her father and his aphorisms, the bits of wisdom that he had collected and with which he had gently lectured or patiently admonished her on those rare occasions when she had been less than well behaved or when she had failed to do her very best in school. Time waits for no man. God helps those who help themselves. A penny saved is a penny earned. Resentment hurts only those who harbor it. Judge not, that ye be not judged. He had 1,000 of them, but there was none he liked better, and none he repeated more often than this one. Pride goeth before a great fall. She should have remembered those 6 words. The operation was going so well, and she was so happy with her work, so proud of her performance in this first major solo flight, that she forgot about the inevitable great fall. Returning to the opened abdomen, she unclamped the bottom of the Dacron graft, flushed it out, then tunneled the twin legs of it beneath the untouched flesh of the groin, beneath the inguinal creases, and into the incisions she had made in the femoral arteries. She stitched in both terminuses of the bifurcated graft, unclamped the restricted vascular network, and watched with delight as the pulse returned to the patched aorta. For 20 minutes she searched for leaks and knitted them up with fine, strong thread. For another 5 minutes she watched closely in silence as the graft throbbed like any normal, healthy arterial vessel without any sign of chronic seepage. At last she said, "Time to close up." "Beautifully done," George said. Ginger was glad she was wearing a surgical mask, for beneath it her face was stretched by a smile so broad that she must have looked like the proverbial grinning idiot. She closed the incisions in the patient's legs. She took the intestines from the nurses, who were clearly exhausted and eager to relinquish their retractors. She replaced the guts in the body and gently ran them once again, searching for irregularities but finding none. The rest was easy, laying fat and muscle back in place, closing up, layer by layer, until the original incision was drawn shut with heavy black cord. The anesthesiologist nurse undraped Viola Fletcher's head. The anesthesiologist untaped her eyes, turned off the anesthesia. The circulating nurse cut Bach off in mid-passage. Ginger looked at Mrs. Fletcher's face, pale now, but not unusually drawn. The mask of the respirator was still on her face, but she was getting only an oxygen mixture. The nurses backed away and skinned off their rubber gloves. Viola Fletcher's eyelids fluttered, and she groaned. "Mrs. Fletcher," the anesthesiologist said loudly. The patient did not respond. "Viola," Ginger said, "can you hear me, Viola?" The woman's eyes did not open, but though she was more asleep than awake, her lips moved, and in a fuzzy voice she said, "Yes, doctor." Ginger accepted congratulations from the team and left the room with George. As they stripped off their gloves, pulled off their masks, and removed their caps, she felt as if she were filled with helium, in danger of breaking loose of the bonds of gravity. But with each step toward the scrub sinks in the surgical hall, she became less buoyant. A tremendous exhaustion settled over her. Her neck and shoulders ached, her back was sore, her legs were stiff, and her feet were tired. "My gosh," she said, "I'm pooped." "You should be," George said. "You started at 7:30 and it's past the lunch hour. An aortal graft is damn debilitating." "You feel this way when you've done one?" "Of course. But it hit me so suddenly. In there I felt great. I felt I could go on for hours yet." "In there," George said with evident affection and amusement, "you were godlike, dueling with death and winning, and no god ever grows weary. God work is too much fun to ever get weary of it." At the sinks, they turned on the water, took off the surgical gowns they'd worn over their hospital greens, and broke open packets of soap. As Ginger began to wash her hands, she leaned wearily against the sink and bent forward a bit, so she was looking straight down at the drain, at the water swirling around the stainless steel basin, at the bubbles of soap whirling with the water, all of it funneling into the drain, around and down into the drain, around and down, down and down. This time the irrational fear struck and overwhelmed her with even less warning than at Bernstein's deli or in George's office last Wednesday. In an instant her attention had become entirely focused upon the drain, which appeared to throb and grow wider as if it were suddenly possessed of malignant life. She dropped the soap and, with a bleat of terror, jumped back from the sink, collided with Agatha Tandy, cried out again. She vaguely heard George calling her name, but he was fading away in the manner of an image on a motion picture screen, retreating into a mist, as if he were part of a scene that was dissolving to a full-end shot of steam, or clouds, or fog, and he no longer seemed real. Agatha Tandy and the hallway and the doors to the surgery were fading too. Everything was fading but the sink, which appeared to grow larger and more solid, super real. A sense of mortal danger settled over her, but it was just an ordinary scrub sink for gosh sakes, and she had to hold on to that truth, clutch at the cliff of reality and resist the forces pulling her over the edge. Just a sink, just an ordinary drain, she ran. From every side, the mist closed around her, and she lost all conscious awareness of her actions. The first thing she became aware of was the snow. Large white flakes sifted past her face, gently turning, lazily eddying toward the ground in the manner of fluffy airborne dandelion seeds, for there was no wind to drive them. She raised her head, looked up beyond the towering walls of the old high-rise buildings that shouldered in around her, and saw a rectangular patch of low gray sky from which the snow descended. As she stared into the winter heavens, momentarily confused as to her whereabouts and condition, her hair and eyebrows grew white. Flakes melted onto her face, but she slowly realized that her cheeks were already wet with tears, and that she was still weeping quietly. Gradually, the cold impinged upon her. In spite of the absence of wind, the air was sharp-toothed. It bit her cheeks, nipped her chin, and her hands were numb from the cold venom of countless bites. The chill penetrated her hospital greens, and she was shivering uncontrollably. Next, she became aware of the freezing concrete beneath her and the ice-cold brick wall against her back. She was squeezed into a corner, facing out, knees drawn up to her chin, arms locked around her legs, a posture of defense and terror. Her body heat was being leached away through every contact point with pavement and masonry, but she did not have the strength or will to get to her feet and go inside. She remembered fixating upon the drain of the scrub sink. With unmitigated despair, she recalled the mindless panic, her collision with Agatha Tandy, the startled look on George Hannaby's face as he had reacted to her screams. Although the rest was a blank, she supposed she had then taken flight from imaginary dangers, like some mad woman, to the shock of her colleagues and to the certain destruction of her career. She pressed harder against the brick wall, wishing that it would suck away her body heat even faster. She was sitting at the end of a wide alley, a blind serviceway that led into the core of the hospital complex. To her left, double metal doors led into the furnace room, and beyond those was the exit from the emergency stairs. Inevitably, she was reminded of her encounter with a mugger during her internship at Columbia Presbyterian in New York. That night he had dragged her into an alleyway much like this. However, in the New York alleyway, she had been in command, victorious, while here she was a loser, descendant rather than ascendant, weak and lost. She perceived a bleak irony and a frightening symmetry in having been brought to the lowest point of her life in such a place as this. Pre-med medical school, the long hours and hardships of her intern year, all the work and sacrifices, all the hopes and dreams had been for nothing. At the last minute, with the surgical career almost within her grasp, she had failed George, Anna, Jacob, and herself. She could no longer deny the truth or ignore the obvious. Something was wrong with her, something so desperately wrong that it would surely preclude the resumption of a life in medicine. Psychosis? A brain tumor? Perhaps an aneurysm in the brain? The door to the emergency stairs was flung open with a rattle and a screech of unoiled hinges, and George Hannaby came out into the snow, breathing hard. He took several quick steps into the alley, heedless of the risk posed by the quarter-inch skin of slippery new snow. The sight of her was sufficiently shocking to bring him to a lurching halt. A ghastly expression lined his face, and Ginger supposed he was regretting the extra time and attention and special guidance that he had given her. He had thought she was especially bright and good and worthy, but now she had proved him wrong. He had been so kind to her and so supportive that her betrayal of his trust, although beyond her control, filled her with self-loathing and brought more hot tears to her eyes. "Ginger," he said shakily, "Ginger, what's wrong?" She was able to respond only with a wretched, involuntary sob. Seen through her tears, he shimmered, blurred. She wished he'd go away and leave her to stew in humiliation. Didn't he know how much worse it was to have him staring at her while she was in this condition? The snow was falling harder. Other people appeared in the doorway through which he had come, but she could not identify them. "Ginger, please talk to me," George said as he drew near. "What's wrong? Tell me what's wrong. Tell me what I can do." She bit her lip, tried to repress her tears, but instead she began to sob harder than ever. In a thin, blubbery voice that sickened her with proof of her own weakness, she said, "Something's wrong with me." George stooped down in front of her. What's wrong?" "I don't know." She had always been able to handle any trouble that came her way unassisted. She was Ginger Weiss. She was different. She was a golden girl. She didn't know how to ask for help of this kind, of this degree. Still stooping in front of her, George said, "Whatever it is, we can work it out. I know you're fiercely proud of your self-reliance. You listening, kid? I've always stepped carefully when I'm with you because I know you resent being helped along too much. You want to do it all yourself. But this time you simply can't handle it alone, and you don't have to. I'm here, and by gosh, you're going to lean on me whether you like it or not. You hear? I've ruined everything. I've disappointed you." He found a small smile. "Not you, dear girl, not ever. Rita and I have had all sons, but if we could have had a daughter, we would have hoped for one like you, exactly like you. You're a special woman, Dr. Weiss, a dear and special woman. Disappoint me? Impossible. I would consider it an honor and a pleasure if you would lean on me now, just as if you were my daughter, and let me help you through this as if I were the father you've lost." He held out a hand to her. She grasped it and held on tightly. It was Monday, December 2nd. Many weeks would pass before she learned that other people in other places, all strangers to her, were living through eerie variations of her own nightmare.